discover a new, in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary. Unlike our previous review, which offers a focus analysis, this feature delivers a comprehensive overview tracing the intellectual roots, key arguments, and real-world impact of this subject. If you appreciate this expanded format and find it helpful, let us know. Your feedback will help shape future content. Imagine stepping back, say, 7 decades, and realizing that the political conflict, the deep distrust, and, well, the outright paranoia we see today might not be a sudden, chaotic explosion.
But instead the direct intended outcome of long-term political decisions.
Exactly.
That is precisely the thesis of the book we are diving into, American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy by the journalist David Corn.
Pretty provocative title.
It is. And Corn's central argument is a documented political history. He shows how the modern Republican Party has, for decades, strategically courted, leveraged, and ultimately amplified extremist and conspiratorial forces to gain and retain power.
And that framing is so important because Corn argues that what we call Trumpism isn't the origin of this phenomenon.
No, he says it's the logical culmination, the unavoidable endpoint of a continuous pattern.
So our mission today is to track that 7-decade story. We'll move chronologically through the major historical episodes the book highlights.
And we're able to do this using our unique analytical structure powered by Google's Notebook LM. It really helps us synthesize this complex material into a dynamic two-host conversation for you.
All right, so before we start, I think it's important to state that we are neutrally conveying the findings and the historical argument inside Corn's research.
Yes, absolutely. This is a look at one historian's interpretation of recent political history.
Understood. Okay, let's start at the beginning. Corn opens by sketching out this evolution of the GOP from the party of Lincoln into a modern party that's struggling with huge social shifts, the New Deal, and these intense Cold War fears.
And the first real sign he points to, the strategy of exploiting public fear taking root. It's the 1950s.
And one figure in particular.
One figure in particular, Senator Joseph McCarthy. The narrative immediately contrasts someone like President Eisenhower, who represented the stable, traditional wing of the party, against McCarthy.
It was just pure anti-communist demagoguery.
Pure and often baseless. And I think a lot of people see McCarthyism as this isolated thing that just burned itself out, but Corn suggests it was foundational.
Foundational in what way?
Well, what's fascinating is how he tracks the party leadership trying to manage McCarthy's tactics. They saw the public's appetite for that fear and suspicion.
So even while some leaders were denouncing him.
Exactly. Others, the book argues, tacitly indulged him, or at the very least failed to curb him, because his tactics proved that manufacturing an internal enemy was a wildly successful way to mobilize a base.
It established a dangerous precedent then, that fear-mongering works, even if it degrades the norms of everything.
And it sets up that internal tension we see again and again in the book. How do the mainstream party elites manage the powerful and often unruly energy of the far-right base?
That energy immediately finds a new home, right? With groups like the John Birch Society.
It really does. Corn details the GOP's early encounter with the Birchers, a group convinced Eisenhower was a communist agent and fluoride was a plot in chapters like No Good Birchers.
The details there are just, they're shocking because it sounds so contemporary, just with different villains. They were anti-government, conspiratorial about almost everything.
They absolutely were. And the crucial mechanism Corn identifies is how the Republican elites dealt with them. The mainstream leaders would often distance themselves rhetorically, saying the Birchers were too extreme,
while at the same time drawing on all that raw, paranoid energy the group was providing.
Precisely. The book calls it the pattern of keeping the cooks quiet.
So it's not just tolerance, it's strategic tolerance.
Yeah.
You harvest the energy, but you try to scrub the really crazy parts off before you show it to the public.
That balancing act was profoundly tested in 1964. With the Goldwater campaign.
Okay, that campaign is seen as a huge turning point.
It is. The book portrays it as a key step in reorienting the Republican Party's appeal, especially to Southern white voters who were very resistant to the civil rights movement.
And Goldwater's language, while not overtly racist, really aligned with those anxieties over federal power and social change.
It did. And that's where Corn establishes the foundational pattern. using cultural anxiety, distrust of government, and coded appeals to race as the strategic basis for building a coalition.
Even if it meant embracing the fringe elements that came along for the ride.
It was a recognition that political power could be found not just by appealing to reason, but by exploiting deep-seated cultural grievances.
Okay, so if the 1950s and early 60s were about reacting to and managing extremism, the book suggests the Nixon years were about actively engineering it.
That's a great way to put it. The narrative moves into the Nixon years, describing the professionalization of these hard-edged campaign tactics. A chapter is even called Rat-Fucking America.
So this wasn't passive toleration anymore.
Not at all. This was active political sabotage and deliberate efforts to inflame voter resentment.
Can you give us an example of how that worked? According to Korn, what did it look like?
Well, it looked like the codification of law and order rhetoric. The book explains how that phrase, especially in the late 1960s with urban unrest and protests, was a powerful, coded racial and cultural signal.
It let the party talk about social control and the dangers of the other without using language that was overtly unacceptable.
Exactly. Whether that other was hippies, black militants, or just the perceived moral decay of the cities, it was a strategic choice, embedded in the operations to create and mobilize grievance.
So Nixon's team basically figured out how to use grievance as a political tool, to define who you were by what you were against.
Precisely. And this period also saw an alliance become institutionalized. Korn traces the emergence of the religious right in the chapter Onward, Christian Soldiers, detailing the formal alliance between conservative evangelical leaders and Republican politicians.
This is where cultural anxieties and morality become political infrastructure, not just talking points.
It fundamentally institutionalized the fusion of social morality, cultural anxieties over things like family structure and the sexual revolution, and national identity into the core GOP platform. It was a critical shift.
Which leads us right to the Reagan presidency. Korn presents that as a fascinating duality. Reagan had this sunny, patriotic messaging.
Morning in America.
Right. But the book argues this was often used to tolerate or downplay the extremist supporters who were part of his coalition.
The narrative really emphasizes that even as Reagan spoke of optimism, the political machine was still accommodating the elements brought in by Goldwater and Nixon.
So the extremism wasn't excluded.
No. Korn details incidents where known far-right or even overtly racist figures and groups found access or tacit support within the mainstream Republican political structure. The optimism was often just the outer wrapping for the underlying anger.
And it was during this time that the slogan, "Make America Great Again," was adopted. That seems like a perfect vehicle for this duality.
It was. The slogan, while on the surface about national pride, also mobilized a deep cultural and racial anxiety. It suggested America was not great and needed to be returned to some idealized past state.
It really appealed to the resentment felt by those who felt they were losing their social status.
Exactly.
Speaking of things that help you process complex, decades-long political histories, this seems like a good midpoint to mention our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments.
A good idea.
We offer AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques there, all designed to inspire reflection and rational thought. It's also, I think, extremely valuable for aspiring authors looking to deconstruct narrative structure and powerful arguments.
Moving into the 1990s, following the first Bush administration, the core message of the GOP shifted even further into cultural combat. Chapters like Not Kinder or Gentler and Spiritual Warfare document how this culture war rhetoric and even apocalyptic religious narratives were fully integrated into political platforms.
The 90s seems so critical, not just for the rhetoric, but for building the actual machinery that would amplify it all. How does Korn detail the growth of what he calls the amplification machine?
He dedicates a lot of attention to the anti-Clinton movement, discussing things like the Clinton Chronicles and the idea of a vast right-wing conspiracy.
This is where talk radio and Fox News come in.
Right. Korn documents in great detail how organized conservative networks and these new scandal-focused media outlets didn't just report on allegations. They became integrated factories designed to amplify suspicion, deepen partisan hostility, and turn political differences into moral crusades.
So where the Birchers in the 60s had newsletters, by the 90s, this network had a multi-platform broadcast infrastructure that could reach millions instantly.
And validate the most partisan claims. That's at the core insight of that section. The foundational infrastructure was now fully in place, capable of spreading polarizing and often factually dubious content with a massive reach.
Which led directly into the George W. Bush years. And post-9/11 fear just provided a new target.
A new target for the same playbook. Instead of communism, the fear was now channeled toward terrorism, which quickly bled into targeting perceived internal enemies.
Groups deemed insufficiently patriotic.
Correct. The narrative emphasizes the continued reliance on fear-based messaging and attacks on those groups, all fueled by mobilized nationalist sentiment after the attacks. It showed the playbook: find an enemy, generate fear, consolidate power, was fully adaptable.
This takes us directly to the Tea Party moment. Korn depicts that as a rehearsal for Trumpist politics. How is the Tea Party different from the Birchers or the moral majority?
The key difference was control. The Tea Party, fueled by cable news and early online platforms, was a grassroots energy that Republican elites could not fully contain. They couldn't just manage it.
So the power had shifted from the party strategists to the most radicalized elements of the base.
Absolutely. Korn details this in chapters like Going Rogue and Feed the Beast. And he shows that while the stated grievances were about taxes and government spending, the driving energy was deeply racialized anxiety about demographic change and the election of Barack Obama.
And the book suggests that following Obama's election, Republican leaders made a conscious choice not to de-escalate that energy.
That choice is pivotal. Korn shows how major figures relied on outright conspiracy, most famously, birtherism and obstruction, rather than trying to temper the fever. The title of that section is The Fever Doesn't Break.
The implication being that this was a moment where the party could have chosen moderation, but instead doubled down on extremism as a political tool.
A necessary political tool in their view.
That decision sets the perfect, inevitable stage for the culmination of this whole pattern. How does Korn describe Donald Trump's role in this trajectory?
Trump's rise is framed as the moment the strategic tolerance finally vanished. He openly embraced the conspiracy theories, the nativism, even the white nationalist adjacent support.
It's all there in chapter titles like I Am Your Voice and Very Fine People.
It is. The party, which had spent 70 years trying to put a lid on the extremist elements it relied on, now saw those elements fully take the reins.
So the book argues that Trump didn't invent this political style at all.
No. He just perfected the marketing and removed all the code. Korn narrates the key episodes, emphasizing that the events culminating in the January 6th attack are treated as the visible eruption of these long-developed tendencies. It was the failure of keeping the cooks quiet.
Not some isolated or unexpected break in the system?
Not at all. The infrastructure built since the 1990s was fully ready to support him.
If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the strength of Korn's argument really is the relentless tracking of that through line. He doesn't just list events, he shows how the players change, but the playbook persists.
That continuity is the core thesis. Korn's structure repeatedly references groups like the John Birch Society, connects their conspiratorial DNA to the cultural warriors of the 90s, and then traces that logic to the Tea Party and beyond.
And the language itself acts as this powerful connective tissue. The book tracks slogans like law and order, the return of Make America Great Again, and rhetoric like I Am Your Voice.
Showing how they are all vehicles designed specifically to channel resentment and link these disparate eras of cultural warfare.
The epilogue, the aftermath, sounds pretty sobering.
It is. It reflects on the state of the GOP and American democracy after the Trump presidency on January 6th. And Korn emphasizes that the underlying forces he's traced, the strategic use of fear, the reliance on conspiratorial thinking, they all remain active and potent.
And it's clear the book was seen as highly relevant. It was an instant New York Times bestseller, with endorsements praising it as this crucial account of how the modern GOP's relationship with extremism developed.
Ultimately, this book provides a very detailed, factual through line, arguing that political leaders repeatedly made the calculated decision to work with or echo extremist elements, and in doing so, embedded what Korn calls American psychosis into mainstream politics.
A history of strategic choice, then, not accidental drift.
That's his argument.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? The book leaves us with a truly provocative question. Is this decades-long pattern of strategic alliance with extremism merely a reversible political trend? Or has the political system now been permanently optimized for polarization, making this pattern impossible to break? It's a real challenge to think about the roots of our current reality. For those of you who want to go even deeper into the structural arguments and historical sourcing, click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally. See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.